I stood at my own wedding reception watching my wife raise her glass, and I already knew what she was about to say would destroy everything. Because 3 weeks earlier I'd found the messages that proved she'd been sleeping with my brother for the last decade. She smiled at the crowd of 200 guests, her white dress catching the light from the chandeliers, and said those exact words I'd been dreading. "This dance is for the man I've secretly loved for 10 years. The room went silent for a heartbeat. Then she walked right past me, stopped in front of my brother Derek, and reached for his hand. Everyone started clapping, thinking it was some sweet family moment, some touching tribute to a brother-in-law. But I just stood there with my champagne glass, waiting for the right moment to ask my father the one question that would make this whole charade collapse. Let me back up 3 weeks, because that's when everything changed. I was at Sarah's apartment, and she was in the shower. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, one of those notifications you can read without unlocking the screen, and I glanced at it the way anyone would. It was from Derek, my older brother by 4 years, the guy who was supposed to be my best man. The message preview said, "Can't wait to have you all to myself after he's finally locked down," followed by a heart emoji. My stomach dropped, not because I jumped to conclusions right away, but because that phrasing felt wrong, felt intimate in a way that made my skin crawl. I opened her phone because I knew her passcode, and when you're planning a wedding together you share everything, or at least you're supposed to. I found the thread with Derek and started scrolling. What I found wasn't just recent flirting, it was years of messages, thousands of them, going back to before Sarah and I even met. There were photos I won't describe, plans for weekend getaways they'd taken while telling me they were at work conferences, hotel receipts, inside jokes about me, about how I was the safe choice, and Derek was the real thing. They'd been together since college, on and off for 12 years, and at some point they decided that the best way to have it all was for Sarah to marry me while continuing whatever they had on the side. I sat there on her couch reading message after message, and the worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, it was how calculated it all was. There were conversations about how my job was stable, how I'd be a good provider, how marrying me would settle things down, while she and Derek could still see each other whenever they wanted. Derek had even joked about how I was too trusting, how I'd never suspect a thing. Sarah had written back agreeing, saying I was sweet but predictable, and that she needed the security I could give her while keeping the passion she had with him. They'd mapped it out like a business plan, like I was some kind of investment vehicle for their double life. I didn't confront her that night when she came out of the shower asking what I wanted for dinner. I didn't scream or throw her phone or storm out. I just smiled, said pizza sounded good, and went back to scrolling through my own phone like nothing had happened. Because right then, sitting there with this information, I realized something important. If I confronted her now, she'd cry, apologize, maybe even break it off with Derek, and then what? I'd call off the wedding, lose deposits, look like an idiot to everyone we knew, and they'd probably end up together anyway once the dust settled. No, that wasn't going to work for me. I needed time to think, time to plan, time to figure out how to make sure that when this all came out, everyone would see exactly who they really were. The next morning, I spent 8 hours going through her laptop while she was at work. I found emails going back 6 years, more photos, receipts for trips that lined up with lies she'd told me. I found bank statements showing cash withdrawals that matched hotel stays. By the time Sarah got home that evening, I'd already made 2 decisions. First, I wasn't calling off the wedding, and second, I was going to need help exposing this the right way. I hired a private investigator the next day, a woman named Rebecca who came recommended through a friend. I gave her everything I'd found, told her I needed proof that would hold up if things got legal, and asked her to dig deeper into Derek's life specifically. Rebecca didn't ask many questions, just nodded and said she'd have a preliminary report in less than a week. I went back to playing the role of excited groom, confirming final guest counts, approving the cake design, pretending everything was perfect. Sarah never suspected a thing, and why would she? I'd always been the trusting type, the guy who believed the best in people, especially family. Rebecca called me 6 days later and asked me to meet her at a coffee shop downtown. She had a folder an inch thick, and when she slid it across the table, I knew whatever was inside would be worse than I'd imagined. She'd found hotel records going back 4 years, photos of Derek and Sarah at restaurants in different cities, even a lease agreement for a studio apartment they'd been renting for 18 months. But the real bombshell was right there on page 3. Marriage certificate, Derek Alexander Morrison to Melissa and Shun, dated 2 years ago. My brother was married, had been married this whole time, and Sarah either didn't know or didn't care. Rebecca had tracked down Melissa, found out she lived 3 states away, and had no idea Derek was maintaining a second relationship back here. I closed the folder, thanked Rebecca, and sat there trying to process what I'd just learned. Derek wasn't just betraying me. He was betraying his own wife. The scope of their deception was almost impressive in its cruelty, and right then I knew exactly what I had to do. I wasn't going to call off the wedding, I wasn't going to quietly break up with Sarah, and I definitely wasn't going to protect Derek's marriage by keeping this quiet. I was going to let them have their moment, let them think they'd won, and then I was going to burn it all down so publicly that neither of them would ever recover. I called Melissa that same night, introduced myself as Derek's brother, and told her everything. She didn't believe me at first until I sent her 3 photos Rebecca had taken of Derek and Sarah together the week before. Melissa went quiet on the other end of the line, then asked me one question: "When's the wedding?" I told her the date, gave her the venue address, and said she was welcome to attend as my guest if she wanted front row seats to the truth. She didn't hesitate, just said, "I'll be there," and hung up. The wedding day arrived exactly as planned. I got dressed in my tuxedo, stood at the altar, watched Sarah walk down the aisle looking radiant and completely clueless, and said, "I do," when the officiant asked. I kissed her when I was supposed to, smiled for the photographer, greeted guests during the reception, and the whole time I had the marriage certificate in my jacket pocket and signed, because I'd already talked to a lawyer who'd explained that without filing that document with the county clerk within the required time frame, we weren't legally married no matter what ceremony we'd just performed. Sarah had no idea. Derek had no idea, strutting around as best man. And when she stood up during the toast with that glass of champagne and those words about secret love, I just watched her walk toward my brother and thought about how satisfying the next 5 minutes were going to be. Over the next several days after I met with Rebecca and got that folder of evidence, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was heartbroken anymore. That had already happened the night I found those messages, but because my brain wouldn't shut off. I kept thinking about all the details, all the ways Derek and Sarah had covered their tracks over 12 years, and I started wondering what else I didn't know. That's when I called Rebecca again and asked her to dig deeper, not just into their affair, but into Derek's entire life. I had this feeling in my gut that if he could lie about something this big, if he could betray his own brother and his own wife simultaneously, there had to be more. Rebecca said she'd look into his finances, his employment history, anything that seemed off. I paid her another retainer and went back to playing the perfect fiancé while waiting for her to uncover whatever else my brother was hiding. 3 days later, Rebecca called me with something that made the affair look almost minor by comparison. She'd found bank records showing that Derek had taken $50,000 from our father over the past 2 years, claiming it was for a business investment, some startup he was supposedly launching with a college buddy. Our dad had given him the money in 3 separate transfers, and Derek had promised to pay it back with interest once the business took off. The problem was there was no business. There never had been. Rebecca had traced the money through Derek's accounts and found that most of it had gone to pay for that apartment he was renting with Sarah, expensive dinners at places I could never afford, weekend trips to beach resorts, even a used BMW he'd bought that was registered under a different name. He'd stolen from our father to fund his affair, and our dad had no idea because Derek kept sending him fake business updates and financial projections, promising the return on investment was coming soon. I sat in my car in that coffee shop parking lot after Rebecca left and just stared at the steering wheel for 20 minutes. My brother hadn't just betrayed me. He'd stolen from our family, lied to our father who'd worked double shifts for 30 years to save that money, and used it to live out some twisted fantasy life with my fiancée. The anger I felt was different now, colder, more focused. I called Rebecca back and told her I needed everything documented, every bank transfer with dates and amounts, every receipt, every piece of evidence that could prove where that money went. She said she'd put together a financial report that would be clear enough for anyone to understand, even people who weren't good with numbers. I also asked her to find out if there was anything else, any other lies or schemes, because at this point I didn't trust a single thing about Derek's life. The next piece fell into place when Rebecca discovered that Derek had been fired from his job 4 months earlier. He'd been telling everyone, including our parents, that he was still working there, still climbing the corporate ladder, still on track for some big management position. But the truth was he'd been let go for expense fraud, padding his business trip reports, and pocketing the difference. The company hadn't pressed criminal charges because they didn't want the bad publicity, but they'd forced him to resign quietly and blacklisted him in the industry. Derek had been unemployed for 4 months, living off credit cards and the money he'd stolen from our dad, and nobody knew because he'd leave the house every morning in a suit like he was going to the office and come back every evening with elaborate stories about his day at work. I started putting together a timeline of everything, matching up dates from the affair with dates from the financial fraud, and I realized that Derek's whole life for the past 2 years had been one massive lie stacked on top of another massive lie. He was married to Melissa, but living part-time with Sarah in a secret apartment. He was pretending to have a career while stealing from our father. He was supposed to be my best man while planning to continue sleeping with my wife after the wedding. Every single aspect of his existence was fake, and he'd gotten so good at it that nobody in our family had questioned any of it. That's what scared me the most, not the betrayal itself, but how easy it had been for him to fool everyone who loved him. I met with a lawyer during my lunch break one afternoon, told him the whole story, and asked what would happen if I went through with the wedding ceremony, but never filed the marriage certificate. He explained that the ceremony itself meant nothing legally in our state, that it was essentially just a party and some words unless the official paperwork got submitted to the county clerk's office within 30 days. He also told me that if I wanted to go after Derek for the money he'd stolen from our father, I'd need to convince our dad to press charges or at least threaten legal action, because it was our father's money and ultimately his decision whether to pursue it. I asked about Melissa's situation, whether she could sue Derek or Sarah for anything, and the lawyer said probably not unless she could prove significant financial damages, but she'd definitely have ironclad grounds for divorce and could go after whatever assets Derek had left, not that he had many after spending everything on his double life. The hardest part of those 3 weeks wasn't keeping the secret from Sarah, it was keeping it from my parents. My mom kept calling me excited about the wedding, asking if I was nervous, telling me how proud she was that I was settling down with such a wonderful girl. My dad sent me a text one night saying he was happy to see me building a stable life, that he wished he'd been as smart and responsible as me when he was my age. Every conversation felt like a knife twisting in my chest because I knew what was coming. I knew that in a few weeks their whole perception of Derek, their firstborn son, would be completely destroyed, and there was nothing I could do to soften that blow. But I also knew they deserved to know the truth, that protecting them from it would just be another lie in a situation that was already drowning in lies. I confirmed with Melissa 2 days before the wedding that she was still planning to come. She'd already filed for divorce, had her lawyer draw up the papers, but she hadn't served Derek yet because she wanted to do it in person at the wedding. She told me she'd been married to him for 2 years and had spent most of that time alone in their apartment while he claimed to be traveling constantly for work. And now she finally understood that all those work trips were really visits back to his hometown to be with Sarah. Melissa said she wasn't coming to the wedding for revenge exactly. She was coming because she needed to see Derek's face when everything fell apart, needed to witness him finally facing consequences for what he'd done to both of us. I told her I understood completely, that she could sit wherever she wanted, and that I'd make sure she had a clear view of everything that was about to happen. The morning of the wedding, I woke up in a hotel room because tradition said I wasn't supposed to see Sarah before the ceremony. I got dressed slowly, checking my phone every few minutes for any sign that Derek or Sarah had figured out what was coming, any hint that they'd discovered the investigation. There was nothing, just normal wedding day messages, friends asking if I was nervous, relatives saying they couldn't wait to celebrate with us. I put the unsigned marriage certificate in my inside jacket pocket, the same pocket where I'd tucked a USB drive containing copies of everything Rebecca had found. I didn't know if I'd need to show anyone the evidence, but I wanted it close, wanted to feel the weight of the truth sitting right over my heart. I looked at myself in the mirror one last time, straightened my tie, and headed to the venue knowing that in a few hours, everyone I loved would see my brother and my fiancé for who they really were, and there would be no coming back from it. The ceremony went exactly as planned. Sarah walked down the aisle looking beautiful. My parents cried happy tears in the front row. Derek stood beside me as best man with this smug little smile on his face like he was getting away with something, which I guess he thought he was. We said our vows, exchanged rings, kissed when the officiant told us to, and everyone cheered like this was the happiest day of our lives. I played my part perfectly, smiling for photos, hugging relatives, accepting congratulations from people who had no idea what was about to happen in the next hour. I saw Melissa slip into the back of the venue during the ceremony, wearing a simple black dress that looked almost like funeral attire, and I gave her a small nod. She nodded back and found a seat near the exit where she'd have a clear view of everything. The reception started, and everything was perfect on the surface. The food was good. The music was exactly what Sarah had spent months choosing. People were dancing and laughing and having a great time. Derek kept slapping me on the back and making jokes about married life and ball and chain nonsense. And Sarah kept squeezing my hand and whispering about how happy she was, how this was everything she'd ever dreamed of. I just smiled and waited, counting down the minutes until the toast portion of the evening. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it pounding in my throat. But I kept my face calm, kept playing the role of the happy groom who had no idea his whole life was built on lies. Then Sarah stood up with her champagne glass and tapped it with a fork to get everyone's attention. The room went quiet and she started her speech about how she'd been waiting for this day for so long, how she'd finally found the love she'd been searching for, how lucky she was. Then she said those words, the ones I'd been dreading and anticipating at the same time. This dance is for the man I've secretly loved for 10 years. She walked past me toward Derek, and the room erupted in applause because everyone thought it was sweet, thought she was honoring her new brother-in-law in some touching family tribute. Derek stood up looking uncomfortable, but trying to play it cool, and that's when I calmly walked over to the DJ booth and took the microphone from his hands. The room went completely silent when I started talking. I didn't yell or sound angry. I just spoke clearly and calmly like I was explaining something simple to a room full of children. I said that before we continued with the celebration, there was something everyone should know about the very special bond between my wife and my brother. I explained how 3 weeks ago I'd found messages between them going back 12 years, how they'd been having an affair since college, how Sarah had decided to marry me for financial stability while keeping Derek on the side for everything else. People started looking at each other confused, nervous laughter dying in their throats, and Sarah's face went completely white like someone had drained all the blood from her body. Derek tried to interrupt, but I kept talking, pulling out my phone and offering to show anyone the screenshots and photos if they didn't believe me. Then I turned to my father, who was sitting there looking confused and lost, and asked him the question I'd been planning for weeks. Dad, remember that $50,000 you gave Derek for his business investment? My father nodded slowly, still not understanding where this was going, and I explained that there was no business, there never had been, that Derek had been fired from his job 4 months ago, and had spent all that money on a secret apartment and trips with Sarah. I watched my father's face change from confusion to shock to pure rage, and my mother grabbed his arm like she needed something solid to hold on to. Derek tried to speak, but nothing came out. He just stood there with his mouth hanging open looking around the room like he was searching for an exit that didn't exist. That's when Melissa stood up from her seat in the back and started walking toward us. The room was so quiet you could hear her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, every step echoing like a countdown. She walked right up to Derek, looked him dead in the eyes, and said just 4 words in the coldest voice I've ever heard. Sign the divorce papers. Then she turned to face everyone else and introduced herself as Derek's wife of 2 years, the wife he'd apparently forgotten about while sleeping with his brother's fiancée in a secret apartment paid for with stolen money. The room exploded with gasps and whispers, people pulling out their phones to record what was happening, and I could see Sarah's maid of honor backing away slowly like she wanted no part of this disaster. I pulled the marriage certificate out of my pocket and held it up for everyone to see. I explained that while we'd had a beautiful ceremony, I'd never actually signed this document, which meant Sarah and I weren't legally married at all. I told everyone I'd be happy to annul this whole situation since legally nothing had actually happened anyway. Then I looked directly at Sarah and said the last thing I'd ever say to her. I hope Derek was worth it. I handed the microphone back to the DJ, walked past my parents who were now screaming at Derek demanding answers, past Sarah who was sobbing into her hands with mascara running down her face, and headed straight for the exit without looking back. I drove to the airport that night and got on the flight to Hawaii that we'd booked months ago for our honeymoon. I spent 7 days on a beach by myself, and honestly, it was the most peaceful week I'd had in months, maybe years. While I was gone, everything fell apart back home exactly like I'd hoped it would. Someone had recorded the whole confrontation on their phone and posted it online where it went viral, racking up millions of views in just a few days. Sarah lost most of her friends and had to move back in with her parents who were humiliated by the whole thing. Derek got served with divorce papers from Melissa and a lawsuit from our father demanding his money back plus interest. My parents stopped speaking to Derek entirely, wouldn't even answer his calls, and last I heard he was working at a warehouse trying to pay off the debt. As for me, I moved to a different city 6 months later and started completely over. I met someone new eventually, someone honest and kind and genuine who thought the idea of cheating was absolutely disgusting. We got married 2 years after the disaster wedding, small ceremony with just close friends and the family members who mattered. And this time I actually signed the papers and filed them properly. On our wedding day, I raised my glass and made a toast about honesty, about how it's the only thing that actually matters in a relationship, about how lies always catch up to you eventually no matter how clever you think you are. My wife squeezed my hand and smiled, and for the first time in years I felt like I could actually trust the person standing next to me. I never spoke to Derek or Sarah again, refused every attempt they made to apologize or explain, and I never once regretted burning down that wedding in front of 200 people, because some betrayals don't deserve quiet endings. They deserve to be exposed in the exact moment when the people who caused them think they've finally won. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.